Hola a todos, estamos acá en Ciudad del Cabo, Sudáfrica. Así que nos vinimos hasta acá un poquito para analizar todo lo que vemos acá en la economía de Sudáfrica, y la verdad que nos encontramos con datos muy llamativos. Primero debo reconocer que previo a venir acá no conocía tanto acerca del país, y me encuentro con que lidera muchos índices, algunos positivos, algunos negativos. Vamos a arrancar con los negativos. A ver, es, según diversas fuentes, el país con mayor desempleo a nivel mundial. Estamos hablando de un desempleo que supera el 32%. O sea, estamos hablando que incluso ha llegado a estar más alto. O sea, que estamos hablando de un nivel de desempleo descomunal. Para que se den una idea, en otros países donde ya encontramos crisis de desempleo, ya estamos hablando de 10 puntos, 12 puntos de desempleo, ya es una crisis de empleo importante. Bueno, acá superan el 32%, o sea que lastimosamente ostentan ese récord, ¿no? Después ahí vi que había algunas fuentes que manifestaban de otros países, pero en realidad las fuentes más confiables que vi hablaba de desempleo récord en Sudáfrica y sostenidamente en récord, ¿no? Esto es lo más preocupante. Otro récord que ostentan es el coeficiente de Gini más alto del mundo. Están cerca del 0,63 del coeficiente de Gini. Te lo explico muy breve. El Gini justamente lo que hace es dividir en quintines la sociedad, en quintiles. O sea, divide en 5 partes la sociedad. Cada una de esas partes se le asocia a un nivel determinado de ingresos. Por ende, si la parte más alta, por ejemplo, concentra más ingresos, tu coeficiente de Gini es más alto. O sea, es más desigual el país. Por ende, si te acercás a 1, sos muy desigual. Si te acercás a 0, sos más igualitario. Vos, si trazás una recta de 45 grados, lo que vos vas a tener es una distribución perfecta, o sea, un coeficiente de Gini de 0. Eso sería la perfecta igualdad, que no existe, claramente. Pero, a medida que vos te desviás de esa perfecta igualdad, dividiendo de nuevo en quintiles a la sociedad, vos lo que tenés, a la población, mejor dicho, vos lo que tenés es una desigualdad. O sea, ¿cuánto te desvías de esa renta, vamos a decirlo así, perfecta o equivalente para la sociedad en general? Entonces lo que nos encontramos es que en Sudáfrica el coeficiente de Gini es el más alto del mundo, o sea, la sociedad más desigual del mundo. Con lo cual, esto es todo un tema y es toda una problemática, ¿no? Y se percibe desde ya, recorriendo las calles, hay una enorme desigualdad entre barrios, quizás como este, que son barrios más, después vamos a hacer un paneo con las cámaras, un barrio más lindo, más que se nota que es un barrio de gente más adinerada, y sectores que son más postergados, ¿no? Y esto, como decimos siempre, lo que es la desigualdad correlaciona mucho con lo que es la delincuencia. Por ende, tenemos tasas de delincuencia, de delitos, que incluso son, por ejemplo, 10 veces superiores a la de Argentina. Que la Argentina no es necesariamente baja a nivel mundial, sino que encontramos entre 10, 8, 7 veces mayores a lo que encontramos en Latinoamérica. Por lo cual, la situación delictiva es bastante frágil y viene siendo sostenidamente frágil. ¿Y esto producto de qué? Desempleo y desigualdad. Vamos, esto es algo importante. Hay presencia policial, se ha notado presencia policial, pero así todo vienen dando mal estos indicadores. Así que el aspecto social en lo que es Sudáfrica tiene bastantes deudas, ¿no? En cuanto a impuestos, ¿qué es lo que podemos encontrar? Bueno, hay otros países africanos que yo los uso como ejemplo, como es Guinea Ecuatorial, que es el que tiene menor presión impositiva del mundo, o Somalia, que es el que tiene menor gasto público del mundo. Bueno, Sudáfrica no está ni cerca de esos estándares. De hecho, la presión impositiva está en el 27%, o sea, los impuestos sobre PIB el 27%, cuando Argentina está en 29%. O sea, tiene menos presión impositiva que Argentina, pero tampoco hay una brecha tan grande, ¿no? Y el IVA, en lo que uno consume, que los precios, hay que decirlo, son relativamente bajos en lo que uno consume, el IVA es del 15%. Bueno, ¿y qué podemos decir acerca de la inflación? Bueno, la inflación la están logrando bajar, está alrededor entre el 3 y el 4% anual en los últimos meses, lo que viene dando. lo cual, de nuevo, estamos teniendo un país estable. O sea, siempre se puede lograr estabilidad, sobre todo ahora que está muy de moda hablar de esta cuestión de estabilidad, sobre todo en países como Argentina. Lo que encontramos es una estabilidad, pero fíjense a costa de qué, ¿no? De un desempleo enorme, de una desigualdad enorme y de problemas serios de inseguridad. Pero la inflación la tienen en 2-3%, ¿no? Y eso hay que decirlo. De hecho, de pisos, y eso también es importante, porque yo siempre doy esa discusión, no es solamente la inflación, sino que es el nivel de precios. El nivel de precios en Sudáfrica es relativamente bajo, vamos a decirlo así. La cuestión social no se queda solo en los datos que nosotros mencionamos, sino que también tenemos la cuestión de la brecha de género. La brecha de género, o sea acá, ¿cuánto ganan las mujeres con respecto a los hombres? Es del 30%. O sea, es una de las brechas de género más altas del mundo. Pero a su vez se suma otra brecha, que es la de los afrodescendientes y la de lo que podríamos decir la población blanca. En esa encontramos una brecha muy grande que, más allá de que vi distintas fuentes, distintos datos, se ve en forma muy manifiesta en lo que es el desempleo. La población afrodescendiente llega al desempleo de casi el 40%, mientras que la población blanca del 7% aproximadamente. Esta brecha que vemos también en las poblaciones que subsisten o que conviven acá en Sudáfrica se pueden explicar por múltiples motivos, pero fundamentalmente por el tema de la educación. Es algo que está muy pendiente acá en Sudáfrica, hay un déficit educacional muy marcado. Y hago un video complementario acá en una zona muy linda cerca del puerto, en Ciudad del Cabo. Fíjense toda la gente que está atrás mío. Fíjense, no sé si pueden ver allá atrás. A ver, vamos acá también. Bueno, lo que quería mostrar, que no sé si se nota a simple vista, es que quienes están trabajando son toda población negra y quienes están consumiendo, toda población blanca. Pero es algo impresionante, lo que marcábamos en los datos es lo que se da en la realidad, miren. Y fíjense esto, ¿eh? ¿Ven ahí? Es algo bastante impresionante, pero bueno, no quería dejar de mostrarlo para que se entienda las diferencias sociales acá en Sudáfrica. ¿En qué fuerte Sudáfrica? Por eso te decíamos que tenía récord tristes y récord quizás no tan tristes, o que también llevan lamentablemente a consecuencias tristes, que es la minería. Para que nos demos una idea, tiene el 70% de la producción mundial de platino. Produce oro, es uno de los principales productores de oro, es uno de los principales productores de diamantes, también produce rodio, manganeso y cromo. Muchos de estos no solamente se usan en joyería, sino que se usan para lo que son el uso de bienes tecnológicos y de todo tipo. Como vimos en el caso del uso de la tierra de Nueva Zelanda, en este caso tenemos que decir que el uso de la tierra es extensivo. La minería requiere un uso extensivo de la tierra. En lo que es el uso extensivo de la tierra para minería, lo que hace, por ejemplo, es que se desplace la agricultura. Entonces, lo que tenemos es que la agricultura, más allá de la actividad económica en sí misma, lo que hace es permitir a las personas alimentarse. Entonces, esa agricultura de subsistencia también se ve desplazada acá en Sudáfrica, con el agravante que la minería contamina el suelo y también contamina el agua, por lo cual trae consecuencias ambientales graves la minería acá en Sudáfrica. Quedan de nuevo, tienen regímenes especiales, parecido a lo que se está tratando de aplicar en Argentina, en realidad sobre distintas bases de cálculo, pero en definitiva tratan de fomentar la extracción minera y poco queda en el país. O sea, en el país que produce el 70% de platino, no le puede dar ni proveer agua potable a la población en general. Y tiene a la mayoría de la población en la pobreza, y tiene un desempleo fenomenal, y tiene unos problemas de distribución fenomenales. En definitiva, como podemos ver, la economía sudafricana es una economía compleja, una economía que no ha traído buenos resultados, o sea que hay que mirarla de cerca, porque así como nosotros vamos a los países donde podemos usarlo como ejemplo y demás, acá lo que encontramos es al revés, son los contraejemplos, es entender que las problemáticas tampoco se resuelven, y eso lo hemos dicho también con lo que fue el apartheid, justamente con lo que pasó con Mandela, toda todos los derechos que los afrodescendientes han conquistado acá, después no se vio traducido en la economía. Entonces esto, o si se vio traducido, se vio en forma muy tenue, ¿no? Entonces esto hay que entenderlo, es un país con muchas problemáticas, es un país que a raíz de verse bendecido en realidad con los recursos que cuenta, no puede traducirse eso en un bienestar para la sociedad en general y un bienestar para la economía. Esto hay que entenderlo. Entonces uno puede estar bendecido por esos mismos recursos y que eso no se traduzca en una mejora para la población. Bueno, pero más allá de toda esta introducción que te di, vamos a tener una entrevista con un profesional que, bueno, acá te lo vamos a presentar. Vamos a tener la entrevista que, como nosotros estábamos en Ciudad del Cabo y justamente la persona se encontraba en Johannesburgo, lo que nos encontramos es que tuvimos que hacer la conversación por Zoom, así que te la facilito acá, espero que la veas y que la disfrutes, así que seguimos con eso. Hola a todos, estamos acá en una entrevista muy especial, justamente con quien nos recomendaron muy especialmente para tratar los temas sudafricanos, así que le estoy agradeciendo acá a Martin van Staden, justamente que es el encargado de las políticas del Free Market Foundation, por lo cual estoy muy contento de tenerlo aquí y que podamos conversar algunos temas. Nice to meet you, Martín. Y entonces arranco con las preguntas. Pregunta número 1. Sudáfrica tiene uno de los niveles de desempleo más altos del mundo, con una marcada brecha entre la población negra y la población blanca, siendo esta última la que tiene mayor acceso al empleo. ¿A qué cree usted que se deben estas problemáticas y cuáles son los factores estructurales detrás de ellas?
Yes, so thank you for having me. And just on that first question, South Africa's unemployment rate is, I think, in fact, the highest formal unemployment rate in the world, at least according to the limited statistics that I see. We always come out on top, and that's about, I think, 13 million South Africans out of a population of about 65 are unemployed formally and have given up looking for work. And perhaps most notably is our youth unemployment rate. So people between the ages of 18 and 35, that's in the high 60s. So we actually have a youth unemployment problem in South Africa. And from the perspective of the Free Market Foundation, we've been around since 1975 in South Africa as opponents to the apartheid system that created this racial caste system where you have a group of haves and have-nots based on race. We oppose that all the way. And our argument was quite straightforward. And that is that the government must allow people to find employment. And it shouldn't tell people that they may not work due to their race or may not work due to some other factor that exists outside of the locus of control of the job seeker. So after apartheid ended in 1994, the new government engaged in widespread liberalization. Many of the previous government's economic controls were deregulated, and that led in the first years, up until around 1998, led to an increase in incomes, an increase in employment for all the racial groups in South Africa. Including the black majority. But then in the late 1990s, 1998 in specific, and then going into the early 2000s, the South African government adopted what it would call labor protections, very stringent legislation that says very well-meaningly that it wants to protect workers, while in fact most South Africans were not working. And that had the effect, in our estimation, of excluding large numbers of unskilled South Africans, unskilled certainly because of the previous regime and its very discriminatory treatment of people based on race, who simply did not have the kinds of skills or work experience to gain access to the labor market, especially given the large role that mining, agriculture, and so on plays in South Africa, primary industries. And that was specifically around wages, but also around the protections of trade unions. South Africa, probably for a good result, trade unions in South Africa have a very strong strike culture, which made sense in the context of the 1970s and 1980s. But since then, whenever a wage agreement is not reached between increasingly less lucrative businesses and their trade union representatives, there is often very destructive strike action that leads to destruction of property and even murder and so forth. There was a big case in 2012 where dozens of people were killed by the strikers and then strikers killed by the police in Marikana. But this is all downstream from a legislative regime that the government has put in place that makes the labor environment very undynamic and very controlled. And of course, the government makes appeals to very well-meaning reasons for why this is, and one has sympathy for those perspectives. But the viewpoint that we've adopted is that we need to solve unemployment first and quickly. We need to get people working. We need to get people not dependent on the state, and then we can have that conversation about are protections necessary. But we need to overcome the first hurdle first of getting people working, and to us that is really the structural factors, not really that contribute to unemployment rate, but actually that causes it. Because South Africans are hard workers. South Africans want to work. They do not want to sit around. And they're simply being prohibited from doing that.
Bueno, razones y políticas para combatir la desigualdad. Sudáfrica tiene uno de los coeficientes de Gini más altos del mundo. ¿Cuáles crees que son las principales razones detrás de este nivel de desigualdad? ¿Qué políticas se están llevando adelante para combatirla y con qué resultados hasta ahora?
Yeah, so I mean the big example that I think everyone will understand what caused high levels of inequality in South Africa is our history, our very long history of racial discrimination enforced by the state that lasted, I think one can say, from the late 1800s to one can say 1990. That certainly led to the exclusion of the majority of South Africans from the economic powerhouses and their relegation really to peripheral economic roles in what was called the homelands, the poorer rural areas of South Africa. And there they had access to far inferior education, far fewer economic opportunities to build intergenerational wealth and so forth. And that has carried forward since the end of apartheid, largely because of what I said earlier, because these are all South Africans who are willing to work and to pull themselves out of the destitution that they find themselves in, but are not allowed that leeway by the state. The white minority population and also the other smaller racial groups have, because they were in a comparatively more advantageous position during the previous regime, they were able to shore up a lot of intergenerational wealth. They had that opportunity to actually work and save and to provide for their children. They were given that leeway. And that is being denied now to Black South Africans. Of course, the thing that is not often talked about is that while there is a large degree of racial inequality between white and Black, there is within the Black community the inequality rate is larger. So there's the Black middle class, for example. Is now larger than the whole white population. The Black elite, one can say, is clearly developing. There's a large number, an increasingly large number of wealthy Black South Africans, but this does not solve the problem of the poor masses, primarily who are poor because they cannot work. And all the so-called empowerment policies that the South African government have adopted have been incorrectly premised. They have all been premised on the idea that the government must not, I don't want to say help, it goes far beyond helping, but must actually do all the work and not really afford Black South Africans or poor South Africans really the discretion to decide for themselves. And that's what it ultimately comes down to. We at the Free Market Foundation have looked at indices like the Economic Freedom of the World Index from the Liberal Fraser Institute and from the Conservative Heritage Foundation. So kind of covering both those bases of what works and where is it that you don't find absolute poverty. And it's always in countries that have respected at a relatively fundamental level the freedom of choice of the destitute to actually provide for themselves. So that would be our submission on why South Africa, not why it had inequality, but why that inequality keeps reproducing itself over and over again. Because we have had this interventionist state for the last 3 decades now. It's now 31 years of the ANC's government in South Africa, and its approach has not worked. And except to the degree that they did liberalize in the early years, and that seemed to work momentarily. And we would say, if we want to address inequality, but more than that, address poverty, we have to get back to a more liberalized, deregulated economy that ultimately respects freedom of choice of consumers and of producers.
Sectores claves y estímulos. ¿Cuáles son los sectores económicos clave que impulsan la economía sudafricana y qué tipo de incentivos o políticas están promoviendo para atraer la inversión de estos sectores?
Yes, so what made South Africa rich, I think as most African countries, the basis was always agriculture, but what ultimately drew South Africa to the international stage was its very lucrative mining sector. So the international community took an interest in South Africa in the early 20th century, particularly because of its gold mines and its diamond mines, and that is why there was a large inflow of population and a large labor force that migrated to South Africa, and in many cases were forcefully brought to South Africa. So mining was South Africa's big, one can almost say the golden goose. Now, since then, it's probably the 1990s or maybe late 1980s, mining has significantly decreased. And we would say that part of the reason why that is because the government nationalized minerals in the early 2000s. The rhetoric around it started in the 90s. Nationalized minerals and petroleum resources. And now mining only contributes about 8% thereabouts of South Africa's GDP. I think probably even less. Agriculture is now on 1%. So South Africa has, perhaps unlike many other African jurisdictions, acquired a very robust tertiary sector. So we have a developing finance sector. We have in transport and communications, for instance, a relatively robust banking as well. Compared to many other jurisdictions. Manufacturing is pretty large, about 14%. Construction is about 4%. But one can say the key thing that we look at is really do unskilled South Africans or lowly skilled South Africans, where would the best areas be for them to find gainful employment? And that, we would say, would be in manufacturing, in mining, in agriculture. And one must then design one's policies to reflect that. So one can have a high minimum wage, for instance, in the finance sector, and that might make sense. But to impose that, for instance, on agriculture would be, given the quite high supply of available labor, would not necessarily work and might actually destroy many jobs that people are reliant upon. So what we would say, the Free Market Foundation's big policy recommendation in this respect has been what we've called the Job Seekers Exemption Certificate, which effectively says that South Africa's stringent labor laws can remain, but that if someone has been unemployed for 2 years, they may apply to the government to say, we want to be exempted from these protections, so that we can find work, gain experience, and get our foot in the door. So we would say that liberalization for the most low-skilled job seekers is very necessary. But if we're moving on from job creation, South Africa is, one can say, without being perhaps too disrespectful, that our return on investment for taxes is extremely low. So while South Africans are quite highly taxed, the productive producers are quite highly taxed, what they get in return from the state is a pittance. We have the highest rates of violent crime in the world, I would say, at this stage, of homicide and of rape specifically. These are extremely common crimes. About 86 South Africans on average are murdered every single day, and there is a rape every 4 minutes in this country. And one can see that as a kind of an attack on human dignity and on individual liberty, but that has an economic downstream effect. You cannot run a prosperous economy when the police are failing in such a basic function to ensure law and order. So the taxes that South African businesses are paying over is not yielding the types of services that government in theory must provide. So we would say that one of the key incentives, one of the key policies that any reformist government here must look into is to reduce taxes quite considerably, and that must obviously mean the cutting of government spending and the reining in of a lot of government scope, just to ensure that the productive sector of the economy is able to breathe and is able to invest and so on, without having to give money to an institution that has not delivered on what in theory it is meant to deliver.
Soluciones de cara a futuro, teniendo en cuenta la alta desigualdad y el elevado nivel de inseguridad, ¿cuáles cree usted que son las principales soluciones para mejorar la situación económica y social de Sudáfrica en el mediano y largo plazo?
Yes, so the Free Market Foundation in the last half of 2014 launched our Liberty First policy reform program, which we tabled to the new government, the new coalition government that includes the ANC and various other parties after the 2024 general election. We tabled this Liberty First agenda to them, where we set out the areas in which they must focus on reform, but also discrete policy reforms in each area. And we used the Economic Freedom of the World Index as a basis for that. So these 5 areas that we said the government must look into, they're very broad, but firstly, it's freedom to trade internationally. There we would tell the government to cut local subsidies. This is a painful but necessary step to reducing corporate welfare, but also then to open up trade into South Africa, free trade, and reduce tariffs and so forth. Part of freedom to trade internationally is also, and this is very unpopular in South Africa, but to also liberalize immigration, to make it easier for people to immigrate to South Africa. We have a large illegal immigrant population in South Africa, but that is perfectly understandable given how well South Africa does compared to the rest of the continent. People necessarily gravitate to success. And rather, from our perspective, rather than treating these people as our enemies, we must instead make it easier for them to come into South Africa in an ordered and easy way so that they don't have to become criminals. But that has to obviously go along with many of these other reforms that we're proposing in the other category of regulation. We've touched on some of this already. There should be widespread deregulation, specifically of labor, to allow people to find jobs as and when they deem themselves ready to work, without politicians second-guessing those decisions. But this also extends to healthcare and to education. In South Africa, we have a government prohibition on the offering of low-cost healthcare options by health insurance. It is unlawful for them to offer cheaper options. We would say repeal those laws, allow them to offer cheaper options, but also encourage competition in education, allow more private schools to establish themselves subject to the state's oversight, of course, and allow that industry to flourish. So that's on regulation. Then the other category is on the size of government. I've also touched on this. South Africa's cabinet has about 45 ministers and many more deputy ministers, bringing the total cabinet size up to 73 highly paid executive government officers for very little in return, as I've alluded to. So we would say cut the size of cabinet. Government cannot exist in a poor country and live with such largesse. It must live within its means, and certainly within the means of the taxpayer. So a smaller national executive, a smaller state workforce, when you have the state as an employer of last resort and it's just taxes that feed into it rather than production, your economy becomes kind of a closed loop that ultimately it's not going to go anywhere. So we would reduce the state workforce, but that needs to go along with cutting taxes, as we've alluded to. So that's on the size of government, the scope and the role of government that it plays within this context of what part of our GDP the government represents. That must become much lower. Then the next category is legal system and property rights. I've also touched on this. The rates of violent crime in South Africa are absolutely unacceptable if you want a growing economy and a dynamic economy. So there has to be significant reforms that decentralize policing authority from this very concentrated national institution that's quite corrupt to municipalities, to provinces, and also allow communities to play a more active role in combating crimes within their areas. Of course, subject to due process and rule of law and all those things. There should be a general decentralization of governance as well. South Africa is constitutionally a federal state, but the way that the government has approached this has been very unitarist, very centralist. We would say that the government has to allow far more dynamism amongst the various jurisdictions, so that we can see what works. Certain policies might prove to work well, and then we can expand them to other areas of the country, and others might not work at all, so we'll know to avoid them. So there has to be that decentralization. Property rights is very key to us at the Free Market Foundation. Just yesterday, the 23rd of January of 2025, the president signed into law the new Expropriation Act, which makes it much easier for the government to seize and confiscate the private property of ordinary South Africans, and sometimes to do so without paying any compensation when it does that. So we reject that entirely. If you want international investment, if you want domestic investment by wealthy South Africans into the local economy, you cannot threaten to take their property from them without paying them anything for it. So that should not even be on the statute book. It shouldn't even be spoken about. If the government needs to expropriate property, it must pay market-based compensation plus money for the inconvenience and the disruption caused. So property rights, very key. And then just the final area of reform solutions that we've proposed is probably the one in which South Africa really does well comparative to the rest of the continent, but certainly internationally as well, and that is sound money. The Reserve Bank in South Africa is a comparatively and a relatively conservative institution, so it does not print money at high rates. It has a fiscally conservative monetary policy. So while price inflation is significant and notable in South Africa, it is not quite hyperinflation, which is something that a country in our level of development must really avoid by any means necessary. And what we proposed there, acknowledging that we're already doing quite well, is to create more degrees of separation between the political branches of government and the Reserve Bank, and to make it more a panel of experts, people who understand monetary policy, and people who are not subject to the whims and passions of daily politics that might cause one to have reckless monetary policy, a debasement of the value of the currency, which we don't have, and we would very much like to keep not having. So those are the 5 areas of reform, the 5 categories of reform where the Free Market Foundation has made various proposals, and one can find those at our website on libertyfirst.co.za, and there's a whole long list of the very tangible, practical reforms that would not just solve inequality in South Africa eventually, but certainly lead to the end of absolute poverty, and that's virtually guaranteed.
Si querés contar algo de la economía sudafricana que no te hayamos preguntado, dejamos abierta la pregunta.
Yeah, I guess it's almost a vibey thing. South Africa's economy is very much unlike the rest of Africa. I think our history plays into that. But you will find, for instance, if you go to Kenya and to Nigeria and virtually any other African jurisdiction, you will find a lot of informal economies stuff. So people selling food on the roadside and so forth. South Africa has a large informal economy. I must say that, but you will not find that in, let's say, if someone from Argentina visits South Africa, goes to Johannesburg or Cape Town, they will see very little of that compared to other African states. So the impression that I think a lot of foreigners will get if they come to South Africa is that South Africa is a developed Western kind of first world economy. And this is something that surprises people often. A lot of people think, well, it's in Africa and Africa is a country, so it's everything is the same in Africa. And South Africa really is exceptional. It's a nice place to go on holiday if you're ready to secure yourself against crime. That's very important. But it also shows that the standard of living that people in the West have become used to is possible in Africa. And that's something that people don't really acknowledge. You can have prosperity in Africa, real prosperity. You can have wealthy people who created value for consumers rather than just rent seeking and getting government largesse. Producers becoming wealthy, the American dream. That's a possibility in Africa, and South Africa is the example of that. And the increasing numbers of Black South Africans who, since the end of apartheid, have taken advantage of this new economic freedom to actually make decisions without being determined by their race, what they may and may not do. That just goes to show that. And to the degree that we are undermining that with bad economic policy, that is to be condemned. But as far as the rest of the world is concerned, there's prosperity here. It can happen here. South Africa is the good example of that. And that's a benefit that should be pushed rather than suppressed.
Thank you very much, Martin. I will make a closing in Spanish, and I close with you. Bueno, acá estamos muy agradecidos con el tiempo que nos dio Martín, desde una perspectiva muy distinta a la que solemos tener acá en el canal, con lo cual estamos muy agradecidos por escuchar distintas voces. Así que, sin más, espero que te haya gustado, que le pongas like, que puedas compartir con quien vos desees, que puedas comentar. Así que bueno, sin más, muchísimas gracias y nos vemos en la próxima.